Hi, everybody. I see a lot of people want to chat in the remote workroom, but I don't want to overwhelm David, so I'm creating this side chat. And here, everybody else can talk about remote work and reference what David and I have been talking about over there. So this is open to all. I'm going to moderate it heavily. In other words, if your stuff is off topic or you ramble too long, I'm just going to delete you right out without remorse. But in the meantime, feel free to talk about remote work, and I will actually stitch some chits in here and maybe even respond to them. Here's a link to the room where David and I discussed remote work.
I'm also quite curious about this particular point. Specifically, before COVID, it was so much the default that you would go in person to a company's main office or one of their main campuses that it wasn't even really a consideration that you could not do that. And I think David made some good points in his large chit about the unseen benefits of being in person, of being able to intermingle and being co-located with everybody. And so I'm almost worried, even if it is the case that it's still plausible for a company to employ some of the greatest engineers remotely, wouldn't it be so much better to have those same great engineers in person? And so in that regard, if they're already oriented, especially after the last few years, towards wanting to work remotely, isn't there something to be said that companies should try to get them to come in person anyways, come to the main location? And how do you even navigate that these days? How do you convince them that it's not only worthwhile for the company, but worthwhile for them?
Of course, ceteris paribus, it would be better to have them all in the same room. It would be better to have them live in your basement and do whatever you wanted while shackled to their computers. But that's just not how humans work. The best people can get to live wherever they want and work for whoever they want. So if you want to recruit the best people, and there is such a thing, Dorothy, as 10x engineers and 100x engineers and even 1000x engineers, because engineering is in the ideas domain and ideas are nonlinear in distribution and output. If you want to be able to access those people, you have to accommodate them wherever they are. So even David made concessions to top-notch engineers. I am sure at David's company, he will recruit a world-class AI developer or scientist, regardless of where they choose to live.
Great points, David. To be honest, I was expecting to disagree with you. I was expecting you to come on and say remote work doesn't work in all cases. And as you rightly alluded to, that's not the case. In some scenarios, remote work is the right solution. And I think in order to figure out when it is the right solution, you need to focus on, one, how is the output measured of that individual? And secondly, how is that individual compensated? So your two examples that you gave, salespeople and engineers. If we look at salespeople, output is very easily measured. They're either hitting quota or they're not hitting quota. There are so many activity metrics, calls, emails, number of meetings. All of that is tracked and logged, so you can clearly see if a salesperson is doing their job or not. Then if we look at compensation, salespeople are compensated based on hitting quota and over-attaining. If they over-attain, there's multipliers, they're incentivized to over-attain, they're incentivized to work. Time is money. When they put in more time and effort, they get more of a reward. So when you have that alignment between compensation and, let's call it, work ethic, then I think remote work makes sense. If I take myself as an example, I am much more productive when I work from home. I am in a sales role. I do love the social side of going into the office, but I go into the office with the acknowledgement that I am not going to be as productive as I would be if I stayed at home. Now, it's fantastic. You get to go in, you meet the rest of the sales team, you meet customer success, you meet the rest of the flywheel team. So it is important, but at an individual productivity level, not for me. Not for me.
This is a really great point in favor of remote work if your company can make it work. Just the other day, I was able to spend a half a day where I had to go to a personal appointment quite effectively working from my phone, which is only possible because of the way that we set up our company from the start. I was able to communicate with my team and do basically everything that I needed to do during that time, and I didn't lose half a day of work just because I had to be in transit.
Is there any bigger waste of time than commuting?
I think this is the crux of the conversation right here, and the main differentiator that remote work is giving us is a transition from generations of people that were coming out of the Industrial Revolution were being part of the big machine, following routines and schedules, punching cards, being told what to do, looking like everybody else, and perhaps looking for symbols of status was desirable. And now we are in a completely different time, mindset, and also empowerment for the individual. And this is going to be reflected in the ways that we choose to work, to live, to be in relationship, and everything.
Taken more broadly, Diana, technology gives us choice. It gives us choice of what to do, who to do it with, when to do it. And anything that gives us more choice is a technology that is fundamentally going to be adopted. And so remote work is technologically enabled. It gives humans more choice. We're not going back.
Hey, it's Pierre from Cal.com. We've been running a remote company, Async First, for 2 years now. Been growing fast, and people really appreciate the love for our product. From my experience, I think having a remote first company with a global workforce has a ton of benefits, localizing your content as well. So if you have a product on the web and you sell to all kinds of different people in different countries, it does really help to, have people from Latin America, from Europe, from Asia, from Australia to chime in and bring in their local expertise, whether it's in translations or in payment processing. I think it's a real superpower to have a global team, and especially because you can interact almost 24/7 with an engineer, whereas if you have a co-located team in San Francisco, up to 8 to 10 hours a day, there's just radio silence. So when there's a bug or whatever, an issue with the service or something, there's always an engineer around when you have a 24-hour available team. Whereas, if a co-located team goes offline, it goes offline. I think that's a really, really big benefit for a small startup as well, because the founding team can decide when to work. I can work in the morning with the India Asian team, but then in the evenings I can work with the North American team if I'm, let's say, based in Europe. And I think that's a real superpower.
I agree. For 24/7 kind of jobs, whether customer service or DevOps, it really helps to have a round-the-world team. But that's less creative work, obviously.
What does everyone think about startup hubs, sort of geographic startup hubs in the world of remote work? Does that make sense still? Is that always going to make sense? Or is it just a matter of time before geography makes no difference and you won't have these concentrations of startups? I'm very interested in that because it seems that if you're, if remote actually truly is the future, especially on the engineering side, then wouldn't the concept of a localized sort of ecosystem just die naturally just with the course of time? You'll have like the legacy people, but ultimately in the long run, it would just be meaningless and everything would be done remotely. So curious what the thoughts are on that.
I think there are two great startup hubs, Silicon Valley and the internet. And then there are some lesser startup hubs, but everything is enabled by the internet. So if you make the internet your home, then you can pick whatever geography you'd like.
Something I've been wondering about is just the social pressure that keeps you motivated. And in my own experience, every time I've showed up in the office, seen my teammates work, keeps me accountable and motivated. For example, it just feels like I can't drop the ball when I see my teammates work so hard. And something I've been wondering about, Naval, is do you have any offsites or any bonding activities to build camaraderie with your team? Because I think that's super important. And also, I think there's a difference between like early career and later career. Early career, I think being in person can be hugely beneficial because of the mentoring opportunities that you need to take advantage of.
Unfortunately, if you need social pressure to be productive, then I think you're going to be bound into local geography. That's fine. It's a trade-off that you make, but then remote work is not for you. But I think we're moving away from an age of tracking inputs and much more into tracking outputs, and the flexibility that you gain in exchange is worth it.
So I've been working remote for the past 4 years, and I do think it's generally a net positive for the industry and for most people. But I also 100% agree with David that it's very hard to replicate the serendipity and the camaraderie that you get from working in person. What I notice a lot of time is remote teams tend to sort of converge on just being more transactional over a long period of time. And your interaction with your coworker will feel more and more like, you're paying for their time instead of you and your coworkers are working together to fight a war. And I think for, startups at certain stages, that's really a death sentence. So to me, a lot of the debate just depends on what stage of the company you're at, what kind of challenges you have, and is that just a trade-off you're worth making? Because, I do think a lot of the remote works problem could be solved by active effort, right? You could spend the energy to make it less transactional, to really kind of build that camaraderie. But a lot of time, it's just not worth the energy. A lot of time, it's actually easier to just get everybody, in the same location and just to fight the battle together, Because I think generally when you start a startup, you really want to try to worry about as little as possible, right? You want to spend all your energy on getting to product market fit, on finding the right customer, finding the right problem. You don't want to have to spend too much energy on sort of building culture and building that team camaraderie. Or, at least you want to have that to be as organic as possible and not spend too much, active energy on it.
Hey, Peer, do you ever struggle with engineers or workers that are just on a completely different time zone and you're just never working at the same time? Do all your conversations with these people just happen async, or you find a way to sometimes do sync conversations?
I do find that sometimes when you're talking about people who are around the clock, the iteration speed gets pretty slow. So you do have to separate them out a little bit by function, because if you're waiting 12 hours for each response, even in async communication, that's way too long. So yeah, completely remote where the whole team is working on the same thing all the time is a little tough. You do want to try and aggregate a little bit by time zone.
Yeah, this is a huge one, often understated in discussions about remote work. And it obviously depends very, very much on the company itself and the individuals. A commute can be anything from an enjoyable 30 minutes to a mediocre 5 minutes to a terrible 2 hours, depending on how you commute and how far away your commute is.
I had been running hard remote first companies for past 20 years, back from the days when ICQ was our only tool. And I think duality between on-site company and remote company is as following. On-site companies are far more forgiving. They're easier to start, easier to scale early, far easier for founders to fix any mistakes, especially if it's first-time founders like Y Combinator grade founders who still don't really know what they are doing. It's their first startup. So everything in early startup cycle is simply easier for on-site startup. But that's come at the price that all the things you're not optimizing for early, it kind of creeps into culture and makeup of the company. And I think thanks to Elon, we now have numeric answer to that, is like how much of that slack from being on site can creep in such company. And so the answer apparently is 75%. In remote company, everything early on is harder, but over long term, you might simply build a stronger company, far more kind of robust and anti-fragile company. But it is not an exercise for first-time founder. So first-time founder trying to build his first startup and his first remote company at the same time, I think he's just doomed to fail. It's too complicated. Remote companies are absolutely unforgiving of any mistakes. If you don't understand how to test for culture fit, if you don't understand how to test for skills, if you don't understand how to build metrics to track productivity, everything will start slipping and that company will become non-competitive very fast. But if it's experienced founders who know what they are doing, all the benefits of putting this process in place early and getting benefits from this process kind of quality and systems for remote collaboration, then I think over longer term, you simply would create much stronger company. With remote first approach, Twitter would never ever would have grown to like 75% extra fluff people who can be easily laid off. In remote companies, such thing is just impossible.
I think you're absolutely right, Max. It would be hard for me to start and run Airchat remotely if I didn't already have a base network of people and know exactly what I wanted and how to run it.
That's a really great point, Pierre. As a startup grows past the phase where it's just the co-founders, you reach a point where the co-founders are working basically 24/7 whenever they're awake. And if there's an emergency, they stay awake to deal with the emergency. But then as you bring on some actual regular employees, you can't expect an employee to be working all the time. And so once you have enough of a headcount that you have more than one person that can solve any given problem or any specific problem, then ideally for those issues, if a co-founder can't solve it, it would be nice if there's always an employee available who can solve it. The problem with being physically located in one place is that requires people to have on-call rotations where they're literally staying up all night, or, taking a night shift or whatever, which is awful. And while some people would probably be fine with that, I'm sure a lot more people would be fine with just being, in a different time zone and working at their regular daytime schedule. So that's like a hidden benefit of not only being remote, but being remote and distributed across all time zones, as opposed to just being remote, say in, West Coast US to East Coast US. Are you telling me the guy I have shackled to my basement is not a 10X engineer?
What do you guys think is the role of whatever's coming up with Apple in remote work, where potentially with pass-through AR, presence can be solved to a large degree, where you can literally sit near people and kind of see them in your space? Do you think this will affect whatever point David had about working together in the same place?
Well, let's see what Apple comes out with first. But in person is so high bandwidth that it's very hard to imagine replacing that with VR, AR just yet, but could happen. So open-minded about it. But even with AR, you don't necessarily have the serendipity factor. You're not stumbling into each other. It's probably still more likely to be scheduled. Although maybe companies can say, hey, between the hours of this and this for 2 hours a day, strap on your headset and wander around. Either way, technology is a one-way tool here. I think all technological advancements will make remote work higher productivity and higher quality, and none of them are going to make in-person more of a necessity.
I agree with Max that for most people starting new companies, remote work is probably a better fit for experienced founders, though I think it's less to do with the company building aspect of it, and more to do with you need a clear and correct product vision before you have product market fit for remote work to succeed. And I think that typically comes from experienced founders working in domains where they have deep knowledge or expertise already, either from a previous startup or because they've invested a lot in the space. For later stage post-product market fit startups, I think the biggest risk of remote work is actually trust between the CEO and the exec team. So one of the common things later stage founders share with each other is that executive hiring rarely works out. The rule of thumb is if 30% or more of your executive hires succeed, you're doing really well. And the two failure modes of execs tend to be either they aren't actually very good at motivating a high-performing team, or they're power-hungry political types. And I think detecting both those failure modes is harder to do in a remote setup where you don't have a visceral sense of what meetings are going on and what's the morale of the team like. AI could potentially be a solution to this. If people become so productive that we don't need executives anymore in companies, we just need really high-performing ICs and maybe a few reluctant managers, that could actually be a good setup for remote work.
30%. That's miserable. I get that might be industry standard, but I guess I've always tried to promote from within anyway, where you know the people involved. And I've never bought this idea of high-performing execs from outside who build and manage teams. They just have to get their hands dirty first to prove themselves. But maybe that's why I like smaller companies.
Yes, the hit rate on internal promotions tends to be much, much higher, but it's very hard for founders, especially first-time founders, to avoid the temptation of wanting to hire a star executive, and especially when they tend to have encouragement from the VCs who think their portfolio companies having these name brand executives makes them seem more impressive somehow.
So I've worked remotely for about 12 years now, and I tend to agree with Naval and David that remote work can work for smaller teams. And I also agree with Naval's assertion that in the future, you won't actually need a larger team in order to scale a business. So that becomes interesting too. I also was a part of 2 companies that did try to scale their headcount, mostly remotely. And I think those didn't go very well. And I'll share the details of those in following chits. But generally, I think that a startup with a smaller headcount, with the right people, and probably some sort of co-location of creative or founding team can actually work very well. So the first growth startup that I worked with grew to about 300 or so people. And they did all of their growth remotely. And all of the people that were joining were very accustomed to working remotely. There was good process. They had a bunch of self-driven people that were joining and working remotely. But the problem was there was a core team of about 20 that were working in office and everyone else was remote. And it became a bit of like an us versus them type thing where like the office people were kind of like adversarial and super transactional against the remote people. So that just kind of turned it into a weird culture, and that company ended up like completely restructuring things and not sure what they ended up doing. The second one I was more closely responsible for grew to about 50 people and went remote largely because of COVID by necessity, but also partially because of preference. And the issue there was that a lot of the people that we hired, and even on the executive team, were not accustomed to working remotely. It was a new thing for them, and so there wasn't this like remote work culture. And so a lot of the habits that you pick up at a remote first company that have been kind of like intentionally put in place to account for the fact that you're remote just weren't natural to most of the team. And it was very difficult. Well, it didn't happen. It was not, we were not able to kind of shift the culture to the habits that a remote organization would have.
I tend to see this as at least 3-dimensional thing or categorical thing. First, it's like the self-driven, creative, motivated, who doesn't need any guidance and they know exactly what to do, and it's more like a result output orientated persons. Then there are those who actually need the guidance and management, and this is like the versus category 1. The next one is like already remote first companies who already have all the processes in place and know how this works, and it's been designed and structured this way, the whole company, versus those who have not done it. So their processes do not support it. The systems are not in place, so it's work in progress. And this is not related even to the persons. It's just like how the company functions. And this is number 2. And the third one is then the generational thing. Those who actually need the nest, needs some kind of attention. And that's the way they function and work, versus those who, it doesn't really matter where they are. And obviously there are like functions like sales where you go out and you are really independent, but it's also, I think, a generational thing. So at least these 3 dimensions categories are at play here and in the mix.
I'm a UX designer since forever, but in the last 18 months, I was a full-time student to learn how to weld. Yes, in a trade school. I did it just for fun, but I'm learning a lot. And Of course, most blue collars are finding remote work discussion ridiculous in a way. But what I found is in some industries like that, they are slowly automating some of the admin, HR, things like that. And now they are starting to be more comfortable in seeing someone else working remotely, meaning a robot. So they are looking at other ways. So I found that remote work can happen maybe after we started automating something. Maybe it's just me, but this is what I'm saying right now.
I agree, remote work feels very transactional. There is less warmth, and oftentimes we jump into meetings and start discussing work right away without even caring to know or ask how the other person is doing or feeling. And even in the times we do ask, it just feels so artificial. Overall, I would say remote work offers less human connection, but then which is why I'm on Airchat. It makes me feel more connected.
I think it might be useful to separate remote from asynchronous as well. You can have a remote company that is still synchronous, but I find it so pleasant to be running a remote company that is also asynchronous. I hate the idea as a CEO of having to be the first person on site and the last person to leave the office. It's so much more pleasant to be able to work whenever you want, and I feel much more productive working that way. So async is the main benefit, I would say.
One idea that I find pretty attractive is the idea of building a team of not just remote workers, but freelancers and micro agencies. So you're setting up a Slack, you have these people, some of them maybe you only talk to once in a quarter where you need help, but they're still kind of your team because you have them in your Slack and they're always available to do work for you, and you pay them only when you need help. That's taking remote one step further.
The serendipity factor is, it exists for sure, but a couple of things. First of all, these reports, like that MIT lab they built, that's been turned off like many, many times. It's not bumping into people. That creates like more innovation, hard stop, yes or no, right? But I think, I'm not saying he has to be more creative, and actually nothing to do with David Sachs whatsoever, but we need to figure out new serendipitous ways to coach when you can't be in the same physical location, but to have some version of serendipity or relationships when you can't be in the same location. It's too backwards. It's not going to stay the same way. And resource allocation alone dictates that the more geographically free you can shop around for what you need, the better businesses are going to do. And contrary to popular belief, the better businesses do, the better the consumer does.